You are tuned in to Beyond Divisions, how we reunite post-elections on the Biyachad Spirited by AJU platform. This is part of a series about the elections, post-elections. Yesterday we had Haley Sofer. Tomorrow we have David Bragg. My name is Deb Engel-Collin, and I am the Relationship Manager for the Miller Introduction to Judaism program here at AJU. American Jewish University advances and elevates the Jewish journey of individuals, organizations, and our community through excellence in scholarship, teaching, engaged conversation, and outreach. This Biyachad platform was developed to deliver online learning that captures the insights of our faculty and friends and convenes our diverse and inclusive community to advance ideas, dialogue, and debate. It is my pleasure to introduce Rabbi Dr. Bradley Shavit Artson. He holds the Abner and Rosalind Goldstein Dean's Chair of the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies and is Vice President of American Jewish University in Los Angeles. He is particularly interested in theology, ethics, and the integration of science and religion. He is also the Dean of the Zacharias Frankel College in Potsdam, Germany, ordaining conservative rabbis for Europe. Today, we have the privilege of Rabbi Artson being in conversation with Rabbi Jeffrey Salkin, who serves as the Rabbi of Temple Israel in West Palm Beach, Florida. Rabbi Salkin is a prolific writer whose essays have appeared in the Washington Post, the Huntington Post, Commentary, Tablet, Mosaic, Forward, JTA, as well as many scholarly journals. He has written and edited over 10 books, including Putting God on the Guest List, How to Reclaim the Spiritual Meaning of Your Child's Bar or Bat Mitzvah. With the regular appearance of his award-winning blog, Martini Judaism, for those who want to be shaken and stirred, published by the Religion News Service, Rabbi Salkin has risen to the forefront, being one of American's Judaism's, it's a tongue twister here, American Judaism's most prolific and quoted rabbis. He has discussed the American political scene on CNN and BBC, and now he can add AJU Biyachad together on that list. That's a great honor, Rabbi Salkin.
It is indeed.
For today's webinar, we ask our audience members to put their questions in the Q&A function, and Rabbi Artson will get to them after their conversation. I'm so looking forward to this conversation between the two of you and the wisdom that you will bring to us. So without further ado, Rabbi Artson, Rabbi Salkin, I'll see you at the other end, everybody.
Thank you very much, Deb. It's a pleasure to be able to be here. It's a pleasure to be able to welcome everybody to my home, American Jewish University. It's especially lovely to be here with a dear old friend. Rabbi Salkin and I have known each other for more years than I would care to mention and wouldn't specify in public, but a long time despite his youthful appearance. And I'm really happy we can be here because this is a really extraordinary time, Jeff. And let's think about, let's launch this conversation. What do you think was different going into the election? What distinguished this, in your opinion, from other times? And the goal here will be, as we curve around this conversation, to think about how we can reunite our fractured country. But let's think about going into it, some of the factors that perhaps distinguish this election cycle from others.
Well, it's good to be with you as well, Brad, and it's a testimony to our friendship that we're able to do this. I've been thinking about this question a lot, and I think that it is true that going into this election, our country has never been as broken in our memory as it is. We would have to go back to the Civil War to find anything analogous. Secondly, I think what we find going in and coming out is that the American atmosphere is one of vituperation and demonization. In other words, the truth is entirely with my side. And if you disagree with me, it's not only that you're wrong, you're less than human. And again, this is something that we haven't seen. Now, I saw that a little bit in the late 1960s around the issue of Vietnam. And the third thing that I think is completely different is, just to be blunt, the presenting personality of one of the candidates. We've never in our political history have experienced such a, how do I be non-judgmental about this, such an extreme personality, and one who is so divisive, and about whom no one can really dance a dance of neutrality. That I think is what is completely different.
Great. And I would just add to that, I think that, what's also different is the circumstances that then were packed on top of that. So a deeply divided partisan split, a country that is more ideologically shrill than in recorded memory. I think in some ways, if there's an upside to the Cold War period, we were also terrified of nuclear threats and communist overrunning the world, that it scared us into civility. You know, when you compare yourself to a Bolshevik, then Republicans and Democrats were on the same side. So there was a kind of enforced civility that also emerged out of the triumphant ending of World War II, that America was seen as the great liberator, the great peacemaker, great engine of democracy in the world. And that also framed our conversations with each other by and large. But then,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, the only thing I was going to add to that is COVID. You know, so there was a sort of illusion. You remember not long ago, some scholar wrote a book called The End of History. And he was arguing that we had solved all the big problems. There were no big scientific issues out there. There were no big economic, like we had kind of, it was just a matter of nailing down the details. And then it turns out a little tiny virus in a place in China we had never heard of is able to literally knock the entire world down. You know, and it makes me think of that verse in Pirkei Avot that that you're born against your will and you'll die against your will and you'll be called to judgment against you. Like, we don't think of ourselves as creatures. We think we're the masters of our fate. We're the captains of our souls. And then this little tiny nothing from China knocks the entire world off of its hinges. And so we entered an already difficult political climate with our social reserves down. We didn't have the ability to sit in coffee houses together. We didn't have the chance to talk over a water cooler at work. Everything was now done on screen, and that accentuated the fact that we tend to listen to people who only think like us. And when we don't, we're scoring points at the other's expense. It's not learning for the sake, conversation for the sake of learning. Jeff, you were going to say something.
Well, I'm glad that you mentioned COVID, because it's certainly the invisible elephant in the room. What COVID has done is it has damaged our defense systems. It has plunged many of us back into a sense of solitude. And you're right, we are living now on our screens rather than in real time. But there's something else as well, which is that this illness has become a political issue. And as we have struggled with it, I think it's fair to say that for many of us, we've reached the end of the narrative of American exceptionalism, that we thought we could do everything. And now we realize that we are really held hostage by a microbe, and that we are also held hostage by a toxic political system, the two of those interacting with each other. And I'll also add, chipping away at our emotional reserves. I think many of us are shorter than we've been. I am not, actually, I'm 6'5", but you understand what I'm saying, that we've lost the patience. Our fuses are shorter. This is, I think, a very, very volatile mix.
Right. And then let's add to that, as you mentioned, for people who are his supporters, part of President Trump's appeal is that he's not like any politician. He doesn't follow the rules that other politicians follow. Left, right, and center, he makes his own way. And I think that heightens this divide, because there are clearly tens of millions of people who resonated to that. And there were also tens of millions of people who were appalled and offended on a regular basis by his character and by his choices of interventions. So how did the election move us into that? Has anything been resolved?
I don't think so, Brad. Well, it seems clear to me that Vice President Biden is now the president-elect. What we have is something that is also unprecedented in American history. We have this pandemic of denial of the results of the election. And we have a sitting president who is obstreperous, who is not budging. We have a party that is agreeing with him. And I have to say the following: when they accuse the Democrats of stealing the election, I just have to wonder how stupid the Democrats are, because what they did was they actually allowed all those Republicans down ballot to actually win.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't work this way. And this leads me to this. This is not a different party. This is not a different ideology. This is, Brad, a religion. Trumpism is a religion. And it is a religion that functions on the irrational. And while you might say, and I might agree, that leftist politics is also a religion, I'll submit to you that the religion of being woke and the liturgy of the call-out culture, while it is painful, does not disrupt this nation. What we're dealing with now is a planned pattern of absolute disruption. And this is what we should be terrified by, because if we can get back to our Jewish texts here, Brad, because that's why we're here.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned Pirkei Avot. Pray for the welfare of the government, because without fear of it, people would devour each other alive.
Yeah.
That the sages could predict a Hobbesian universe,
Right.
in which there's utter chaos. And I will say to you this: I look at history, I will say to you that Jews had much more to fear in the interstitial moments between regimes than they had even under the strongest, and in some cases most tyrannical of leaders. Jews fear chaos. I mean, you're someone whose work I've admired because how well you have integrated science and theology. Well, it's not only that we fear primordial chaos, we fear social chaos.
Sure.
That's what sent our great grandparents here.
Right. So then when we think about this, and we've got a couple of questions that I wanted to put out there. We don't have to address them explicitly, but I'll just share them. So Nancy wants to point out, why hasn't the prospect of planetary annihilation due to climate change had a similar sobering effect on humanity as the Cold War did? And I guess, Nancy, I'll give you a quick shot at my answer to that, is that the Cold War pointed in a particular direction. It was two sides against each other. And so one side had to band together. We didn't have the luxury of quibbling with people on our team. But because climate change threatens the entire planet, there's no other team in a sense. And a large number of people have responded by simply denying the scientific evidence, which gets back to what Rabbi Salkin was talking about. Above and beyond left-right kinds of distinctions, you know, the arguments between the Clinton and the Reagan, or the Bush and the Carter, like those arguments were kind of standard left-right things, all with people who played by the rules. And one of the rules that America has used so successfully is we defer to the experts, right? So Republican administrations and Democratic administrations deferred to scientists to tell us what the science was telling us. And then we might argue about what policy could address that best, but we deferred to the scientists. This is the first time I can remember where the planned response is simply to try to discredit any expert. And there's a mistrust of professionalism. There's a mistrust of training so that I should be able to intuit as well as someone who spent their life studying epidemiology, right? And that's discontinuous with what led to the American quarter century, this idea that we're going to now banish the experts and we're going to allow partisan politics not only to propose the solutions, but they get to define what the reality is.
Brad, this has been the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination of American politics for almost 200 years. I'm thinking of Richard Hofstadter's book, Anti-Intellectualism in American Life.
Mm-hmm.
There has been this snickering at the elites. It happened during the Nixon years when Spiro Agnew used the line written by the late William Safire, the nattering nabobs of negativism, the Eastern elite, the expert class. I don't believe I'm paranoid, Brad. When I hear people talking about elitists, I think they're talking about me.
Yeah.
And I didn't even go to an Ivy League school. This attack on expertise is an attack on competence. It is an attack on the intelligentsia. And there has never been a society wherein the intelligentsia have suffered attack where the Jews have also not suffered.
Okay, so that's a kind of pragmatic self-focused reason to also distrust. But I want to say that to the degree that there has been some American exceptionalism, the good kind of American exceptionalism has been that we have been singularly capable of harnessing our experts to the solution of problems, right? We started out behind in the race to the moon, and we ended up being first because of a certain American ability to unleash human creativity and to focus it. And that meant everybody knew their role. Everyone had a part to play in getting someone on the moon. And that's what's being assaulted these days. But I'd like to move to a different topic as well. So one of the challenges that I've noticed, I think back to my grade school and high school education. And when I look at the textbook I was given when I was in fourth grade of American history, there were no women in it except for Betsy Ross, right? And I was going to school in the early 60s, so we didn't yet have Betty Friedan. But essentially Betsy Ross was it. You know, maybe there was a suffragette or two, I'm not sure, but it was basically men. And there were also no Black people, except for when we got to slavery. So the version of history that I was given was a sanitized version. I did go to an Ivy League school. I majored in American history and literature at Harvard University, which is, I think, like the mother church of American civilization. And what I was struck by in my looking back at what I read, we didn't read any African-American authors, right? We read mostly white Protestant men. And that was presented as American history and American culture. And part of what I've seen over the last several years is this astonishing awakening. How did we not see what was in plain view? How did we think that we were, as they like to, an imperfect union, striving towards greater perfection, as if this was just a little blemish rather than a feature in the system? And so part of the struggle, things that were known in the minority community all along, the white community is starting to have deep conversations about the role of race and the structural challenges of race. And this last administration seemed uniquely resistant, right, to even exploring it. Reagan, no great fan of racial conversations, but at least there were such discussions taking place. President Bush, similarly. But this administration has been witnessing, at the very least, and many people think participating in, the resurgence of racism, anti-Semitism, a whole host of misogyny. How do we talk about how that is now coming from very high places and how that may be different too.
I think that what has happened, Brad, is that the immune system has been shattered. And I think with that, what links this piece of the conversation to the climate change piece, and that's something I've been very involved with for a number of years living in South Florida, especially the issue of sea level rise, is that we've been living in a state of denial. And that we've thought that these issues apply to other people and not to us. And in some ways, with the climate change conversation, we've found ourselves engaged in what Robert J. Lifton referred to as psychic numbing. It was the same thing that happened when we were talking about nuclear war. This administration, it seems to me, has vigorously tried to turn back the clock on every social revolution and evolutionary movement that we've experienced in the last 50 years. And it's back to the denial of science, whether it is the denial of the physical sciences, the medical sciences, or now I would say the denial of the social sciences. What we have to struggle with right now is racism part of the design flaw in American democracy? Is it native to it? Is it something without which we could not imagine this country? Or is it something that is incidental to the narrative, but has grown to such an extent that it is impossible for us to confront life without it? I'm among those who believe that the founders were decent people who made the only choices that they would have made in that particular society, that the ideals they created are still the ideals that we should aspire to, that they were all slaveholders, including, by the way, Hamilton, is sad, tragic, and a product of a system in which they were, well, let me use the halakhic term. They were, you may want to explain this further, in some ways the tinok shenishba. They were the captive infants who had no choice but to live within that system. We have choices, and we can make those choices in perhaps a more credible way than they could have.
Let me share with our listeners, and then I want to move this in a different direction. I had a wonderful teacher when I was in rabbinical school, Rabbi Dr. Simon Greenberg. And Dr. Greenberg remains among my heroes to this day. The founding president of American Jewish University, he and Mordechai Kaplan used to take a train out from New York, and they would spend their winters in California, creating this wonderful institution. He talked about how the Declaration of Independence, the Gettysburg Address, he viewed as sacred scripture, meaning he saw them as revelation. And what revelation means is that the people who hold the pen haven't a clue what they're writing, right? That the power of the writing, the ideas in the writing, so transcends its cultural origin that you spend the next several millennia attempting to live up to what it holds out for you. And he says that's true of the Torah as well. There's no way in the late Iron Age that people could look in the Torah and understand the implications of let the earth rest, of pay your laborer his wages on time, of everyone made in God's image. These are ideas we continue to aspire to. And the Torah set the bar so that it didn't have to be understood. And the Talmud talks about that Moses didn't understand the Talmud as well as Rabbi Akiva did 1,000 years later. I think that's true, and I agree with my teacher, Rabbi Greenberg, that that's true for the Declaration of Independence and the Gettysburg Address and those books as well, that these documents exceeded the grasp of their authors, right? And I don't want to minimize that Thomas Jefferson could be sleeping with a slave and also running a concentration camp, which is what that plantation was. It's not a minor thing. So the challenge is it's both. It's a huge feature of the system, and we have to transcend it because of the gifts in part of some of those slaveholders who were the vessels of ideas that were bigger than they could grasp, right? And so ultimately, I have to run with the ideas. I want to move, if I could, Jeffrey, in a different direction. So now I want to be a bit provocative to the liberal bubble. I don't think we can say that 71 million people are all deplorable idiots. I don't believe that for a moment. I think that Americans are, like all people, fundamentally good and doing the best they can. So yes, there may be some people among the Trump coalition who are motivated by racial animus. I don't doubt that too. But I think the vast preponderance of them have some real issues with the liberal coalition that we can't brush off. And part of the challenge has been that people in my part of the world and on the Eastern Seaboard just disdain and disregard their real concerns. So I want to challenge that. I want to notice that before we get on our moral high horse, that my part of the world has benefited from the last 30 years of growing internationalism. The new economy has been great for California. You know, we're selling the phones and the computers that the whole world is using. We're on Zoom because of my neighborhood, right? So we're cashing in and we're doing fine. But there are enormous parts of this country, the Appalachians, the Rust Belt, other places, whose economy has been tanked by this new world order. And while we progressives in our bubbles were happily marching both to the bank and to the museums, we were ignoring the very real despair that these transformations were causing in vast swaths of our country. So it does feel to me, and I just need to put this out there, I'd love to hear your thoughts. It does feel to me that if these next 4 years are going to make a difference, it can't just be that we teeter-totter. The right hates the left hates the right. When we're in power, we try to clobber the other guys. When they're in power, they try, like it. That's an endless recipe for disaster. So these next 4 years have to be an invitation to take seriously, why would well-intentioned people line up the way they did? And why would they feel so militantly? Why is there so much anger at Trump rallies? Why is there so much scorn? And it's easy to just brush it off. It's easy to just believe, but I think we're missing the only path to transformation, which is we have to start taking people who disagree with us seriously enough to tweak out what's of value in their criticism and to ask, why are they so afraid? Okay, don't just say they're based on fear as some dismissive thing. Okay, if they're afraid, I need to find out what they're afraid of. And then I need to make sure that there's a remedy. I'd love to hear your thoughts, Rabbi.
You know, one of my favorite books, and one of the books that I recommend the most, is the book written by my friend and teacher, Yossi Klein Halevi, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor. What Yossi does so effectively in that book is he actually listens. He encourages us to hear. And the American left has become enamored with the idea of hearing. We hear women, we hear the poor, we hear the Palestinians, and I would not want to negate any of this. But our auditory talents do seem to stop at the people who live in the flyover states. It occurred to me, Brad, that America is divided not along geographic lines. It's really divided along demographic lines. There are the urban/suburban areas, and then there are the rural areas, and that the urban and suburban areas are more like each other wherever they are around the country than they are similar to the rural areas that are only 10 minutes away from wherever you live.
Mm-hmm.
I think that we have to start an aggressive and assertive program of listening to each other. Now, I will say this. American popular culture, of which I am a student and about which I write regularly, has always taken great delight in laughing at them. Brad, you and I grew up in the '60s, so you certainly remember the Beverly Hillbillies, Gomer Pyle, Green Acres.
Mm, the
We're
good old
talking,
days.
we're talking about our childhood, but the hidden message there was these people are rubes.
Right. Right.
And they're tired of it.
Right.
Tired of it. If anything, the message behind Schitt's Creek is that this elitist family begins feeling like fish out of water in this nothing place, and they come to love the people
Mm-hmm.
and are transformed by it.
Mm-hmm.
There was that wonderful episode where the whole tone changed, where they're having dinner with old friends, and the friends are laughing at the community in which they live. And
That's right.
Dean Levy says, these people were there to help me. Where were you?
Right.
So I think that we need to listen to each other. Now, having said that, it must be reciprocal.
Right.
I'm entirely prepared, emotionally, psychologically, sociologically, and theologically, to hear people from the other side who are not ordering coffee in which it necessitates the use of a paragraph. But they need to hear us too. They need to hear our fears of anti-Semitism, our fears of xenophobia, our fears of women's rights disappearing before our eyes. We have to acknowledge each other's fears. That's what Martin Buber talked about in terms of holding each other in an I-thou relationship. I have a little thing I'm going to suggest to our audience. I wish I did this more often. I gave a sermon about this on the High Holy Days. And I said, when you meet someone with whom you vociferously disagree, try the following trick. Ask that person, how did you get to that opinion? And walk with them through their thought process.
Mm-hmm.
You might actually find that you have the resources to strengthen their ideas and vice versa.
That's great.
This is where we come from. The left, the Jewish left, enshrines this prophetic pretension. Thus saith the Lord, Isaiah, Amos, etc. Heschel. But there was another side to Heschel, which was the Talmudic scholar. We're in a rabbinic period now. We're not in a thus saith the Lord. We're in the necessity of elu ve'elu, these and these. And how do we take that? Well, for me, it's really very simple. Emet, the word emet, truth. If you write it out, if you write the Hebrew alphabet out from right to left, Aleph is the letter that's furthest on the right, Mem is the letter that's in the middle, and Tav is at the very end. It's the middle, the right, and the left that together must give us a kind of truth.
Great. I just want to make sure everyone understands that those three letters, friends, are the three Hebrew letters of the word emet, which means truth. So the first Hebrew letter of the alphabet, the middle one, and the final one, they come together to make the Hebrew word that means true. Great. So let's move on. The election has happened. There are some people who believe that we have a president-elect, and there's a cadre of people who are insisting that that's premature and that we're not there yet. Many of the people who are saying that also concede that it's likely that the outcome will remain the same. So let's move forward into that next step, which is, what do you and I want to offer as distinctively Jewish wisdom to make this transitional period not simply the next volley in a partisan sterile warfare, but the beginning of some kind of deeper healing? What's it going to take? What can we offer as as wisdom from the Masorah, from our tradition, from our historical experience, how can we help move this forward?
Well, the first piece would be what I just said, which is the idea of being able to listen to each other. But I also think there's something else. In the path of those who would vociferously and vigorously deny the election, I think what we as American Jews have to do is we have to stand up for the stability of our government.
Mm-hmm.
It's called hakarat hatov. It's the recognition of the good. If I can paraphrase Garrett Morris from the old Saturday Night Live program, America has been very, very good to us. America has been very good to us as a people. And the least we can do is to urge sanity and to remind ourselves of what we pray in the prayer for the government. We have an investment in orderly transition. As for what we can humanly offer each other, I think that really comes down to, am I willing to live in community with people with whom I do not agree? Am I willing to see them as also made B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God? When I write my political autobiography, I really think it's going to be based on the text about how when the children of Israel walked through the Red Sea or the Sea of Reeds, the waters parted, and there was a wall on the left and there was a wall on the right. And that's how I feel. I'm always bumping into those walls.
Yep.
I want to walk down the middle because I think that the truth is larger than what we know.
I think that's amazing. And let me just build on that. I spent the last 4 years saying to my friends on the left, American democracy and our republic, our institutions, are more resilient than you give them credit for. Whatever assaults there may be on the norms of civil discourse, our institutions will survive. Our institutions will withstand. And I consider myself vindicated in that judgment. Whatever ways politicians tried to thwart the democratic process, here we are now emerging out of it, and the electorate were able to be mobilized. We had more votes than at any point in our past. I love the fact that the candidate who got more votes than anyone in the history of our country was Joe Biden, and the candidate who got the second largest number of votes was his opponent. Right? That is to say, we were able to register so many new voters across the spectrum, and the system worked. It delivered a sizable mandate for a change of direction. That's what Thomas Jefferson anticipated, a periodic reinvention of the American government. Every 4 years, we have a revolution without blood. And that's the great miracle. It doesn't mean that people don't suffer along the way. It doesn't mean it's slow and unwieldy. It just means that at the end of the day, the people can rise up and they can replace the powerful. And that's an astonishing, astonishing reality. And I feel like I said it for 4 years to the left, and now I need to say it to the right, that you have to trust in the system. You have to trust in the way American democracy moves forward, even when you don't like the outcome in the short run. You have to trust in the collective ability of the American people to move it forward. And the strength of our institutions depends that we bring our goodwill to it, that we defer to those institutional concerns, that we're not so gung-ho on our own partisan agenda that we do damage to the institutions. I'll give you what I think is the primary example of that right now that I think is threatened. It is our conviction that the Supreme Court rises above partisanship, that allows it to be the mediator of the world's oldest functioning constitution. The minute we start to think of the Supreme Court as equally partisan with Congress and the White House, we're in serious trouble. So moving ahead, I want to ask you another cluster of questions. So When you and I grew up back in the late Neolithic period, there were basically 2 or 3 channels on TV. You could hear Walter Cronkite tell you the news. You could hear Huntley Brinkley tell you the news. That was it. Like the whole country listened to these people who then by definition were pressed to speak from the center because they had to hold a broad audience together. But now we have 100,000 different news shows going on simultaneously. So I can go to the good-looking left-handed Jewish curly-haired newscaster because there's a show for that. And I don't have to listen to anybody else. So even the way our media works now encourages fragmentation. It encourages reinforcing the bias with which we approach the show to begin with. And we rarely get something like right now where people can openly and freely exchange different ideas. And here, if I can just speak to the listeners, I want to put in a plug for Biyachad, because what this program does so brilliantly is it brings together speakers across the spectrum so that we can educate ourselves by hearing people who don't just chew and reflect back what we already thought. How can we help hold the media to a role of being able to present perspectives while holding to verified truth so that the American people are both informed and educated because of a free press?
I wish I knew the answer to that one, Brad. I think that the proliferation of these various news media is, of course, part and parcel of the proliferation of the internet. And it's also something beyond that. It's that we as Americans are drowning in choice, and that every day we are confronted with more consumer choices than we ever would have had before. We're also confronted with more ideological choices than we ever would have experienced before. So it's not a surprise that what you're describing is absolutely correct. We get to move into our internet tribes, and that becomes our reality. I don't know how we hold the media more responsible, because they unfortunately are simply functioning according to a market economy. I know with sadness that even with our relief over the end of the election cycle, that we lost Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs of blessed memory. And in his most recent book, the last book that he wrote on morality, he talks about what happens when the market economy takes over. And when the market economy takes over, you get to buy what you want, and you get to buy the truth that you want as well. The genie is out of the bottle, and I don't know how we are able to put it back in. There's my frustration, I think, is very high on this point.
Admittedly, I think for many of us, there's a great deal of frustration that there's a whole chunk of media people who feed their audiences the truth they want to hear, rather than really exploring what the reality is that we then need to respond to.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely right.
So that is true. All right. If you had the ear of the incoming administration addressing the issue of how to be not just the president of the red states and the blue states, but the president of the United States, give me a couple policy points.
Well, I think that there has to be some kind of balance between that which is ideologically pure and that which is economically viable for all Americans.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure that we've driven in that particular direction. Number two, speaking from the very narrow viewpoint of the American Jewish community, I think that President-elect Biden needs to do what he would have done anyway, which is to reassure the overwhelming majority of American Jews that the peace process will continue, his commitment to a two-state solution, a refusal, this might be controversial, to move the embassy. While I might not have been in favor of that move, lahatchila, b'diavad, in the very beginning, now that it's done, I think to erase that would be disastrous. And as for the third, I think you mentioned it earlier. I think there has to be an understanding on the part of all Americans that we have to invest ourselves in healing the climate challenge, because what we're about to experience here is the crushing of the American real estate market. Insofar as I'm speaking from my state, I can go out onto my balcony and I can see the Atlantic Ocean from where I am. But what happens when the water rises and you can't get flood insurance anymore, and your house is worthless? But it's not only on the coasts, it's also inland as well. So I think there has to be a massive American program in understanding and educating people about this present danger.
Wonderful. I guess I would add to that, I hope that the administration will live up to what they're claiming to do, which is to really focus not just on the narrow concerns of their base, but also of being able to focus on the breadth of American concerns and weed out what's legitimate in them from what's not, right? And be able to respond to the legitimate parts of the concern. I also think this is a unique inflection point in our country's history, because we have the second vice president who's a person of color. I found an interesting statistic. The first vice president of color was appointed under Herbert Hoover, who had someone who was a recognized member of the Choctaw Native American tribe. So leave it to Herbert Hoover to get there first. But the fact that we are taking seriously the life stories of much more diverse Americans than we ever did, and that they are becoming part of the story, I think that's crucial. I'm going to need to start to transition us to the end. I want to thank Rabbi Salkin for his remarkable insights. I want to thank our listeners who were posting questions, and hopefully we were able to weave many of them into our conversation together. And I think it's the business of rabbis to bless. So here's what I want to leave us with. I want to leave us all with a blessing. Let's reach for the light and not just for the heat. Let's find ways to, when we talk about the people we don't agree with, present the best possible version of their concerns and their life stories, not the cartoon version. Let's not think foolishly that we win by their losing, that we in fact all win together because we're all in this together. And I, for one, retain full confidence that a United States that is true to the best aspect of its heritage is more than capable of leading the world into a renaissance in which the best is yet to be. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much. I will end with an amen, amen, amen to your beautiful blessing, Rabbi Artson. Rabbi Salkin, thank you so much. And again, Rabbi Artson, thank you for shouting out to this B'Yachad platform. This is really what American Jewish University stands for. And this was so interesting to me in terms of balance, and I loved what you said, Rabbi Salkin, about emet, and that it's right. It's in the middle. It's everything together, and to be united. And tomorrow, audience members, you have a chance to hear another perspective on all of this. So we invite you to come again and again to learn with us, to hear wisdom, to challenge yourself, to hear other viewpoints, and to grow in our knowledge and Jewish wisdom. So thank you, everybody, Stay safe, and we'll see you again. Bye-bye.
Shalom.
Right now, shalom, everyone.